December 14th, 1923, BR, Hillcrest, Pennsylvania. When groundskeeper Thomas Brennan's shovel struck something solid beneath the frozen earth behind Riverside Sanitarium, he assumed he'd hit a rock. The asylum superintendent, Dr. Hermann Volk, had ordered him to dig a new drainage trench that morning. Unusual work for the dead of winter. What Brennan unearthed wasn't a rock. Bar, it was a human skull. Br, then another br, then another. By the time the sun set that winter evening, Brennan had uncovered the remains of at least 7 bodies, all buried in unmarked graves less than 40 yards from the asylum's main building. None had coffins. None had identification. Br, and according to Riverside Sanitarium's official records, none of them had ever existed. Dr. Hermann Volk, the respected physician who had treated Pennsylvania's mentally ill for over 15 years, had been making his patients disappear. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the vanishing patients of Dr. Hermann Volk, the asylum that buried its mistakes, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We bring you the darkest, most forgotten chapters of history, the stories they tried to erase. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into the nightmare that was Riverside Sanitarium. The year 1908 marked the beginning of what many historians call the golden age of psychiatric reform in America. Following decades of scandal surrounding asylum conditions, states across the nation poured funding into modern mental health facilities. BR, Pennsylvania was no exception. Riverside Sanitarium opened its doors in the spring of 1908 in Hillcrest, a rural township 40 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. The facility represented everything progressive reformers had envisioned: a sprawling 3-story brick building set on 12 acres of manicured grounds, large windows to let in natural light, separate wings for men and women, and recreational spaces designed to soothe troubled minds. The sanitarium could house up to 60 patients. Its mission, emblazoned on a bronze plaque in the entrance hall, read, "Healing through compassion, science, and moral treatment." Dr. Hermann Volk arrived at Riverside in 1908 as its chief and only physician. At 34 years old, Volk came with impeccable credentials: a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, specialized training in neurology in Vienna, and glowing recommendations from colleagues who described him as tireless in his devotion to the mentally afflicted. Br. Volk was a tall, imposing man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore fine 3-piece suits even when conducting ward rounds. Patients and staff alike called him Dr. Volk, never Herman, never Sir, but he demanded formality and received it. The residents of Hillcrest viewed the sanitarium with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because their small community now housed a modern medical facility. Unease, because the patients within its walls represented society's most vulnerable and unpredictable members. Br. But Dr. Volk assured the township council that Riverside would operate with the highest standards of care and safety. For the first few years, everything appeared exemplary. Volk published papers in medical journals about his treatment methods, a combination of occupational therapy, fresh air, and what he termed corrective discipline. Br. He gave lectures at nearby churches about the importance of compassion for the mentally ill. He even invited local dignitaries to tour the facility, showing them patients engaged in gardening, needlework, and other wholesome activities. But behind Riverside's progressive facade, something dark was taking root. The sanitarium operated with remarkable autonomy. Located in rural Pennsylvania, far from the scrutiny of state inspectors who were overwhelmed with facilities closer to major cities, Riverside submitted annual reports but rarely received in-person visits from regulatory authorities. Dr. Volk answered to a board of trustees composed of local businessmen, none of whom had medical training. The staff at Riverside consisted of Dr. Volk, a rotating cast of nurses, several orderlies, a cook, and maintenance workers. Turnover was high. Nurses rarely stayed longer than a year. When asked why, they cited the demanding nature of the work or philosophical differences with Dr. Volk's methods. Br. What they didn't say, what they couldn't say without risking their reputations, was that something felt wrong at Riverside Sanitarium. Something they couldn't quite articulate but felt in their bones every time they walked those spotless hallways. The patients came from all over western Pennsylvania. Some were transferred from county poorhouses. Others were committed by family members who could no longer manage their relatives' erratic behavior. Still others were sent by courts after being deemed lunatic or feeble-minded by judges who saw institutionalization as the only solution. Most arrived with paper trails, admission forms, medical histories, letters from family members, but once inside Riverside walls, those paper trails often went cold. In January 1912, Martha Hodge of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, stopped receiving letters from her sister Clara, who had been admitted to Riverside 6 months earlier for what doctors called melancholia with nervous exhaustion. Clara had written faithfully every week since her admission. Her letters, while tinged with sadness, suggested she was improving. She described the asylum's library, the other patients, the walks around the grounds. Then abruptly, the letters stopped. Martha wrote to Dr. Volk inquiring about her sister's well-being. She received a brief reply on Riverside Let. Terhead, Miss Clara Bentley continues under our care. Her condition requires that she minimize external stimulation, including correspondence, but we will notify you of any changes. Martha found this odd. Clara had never mentioned restrictions on letter writing. She wrote again 2 weeks later asking to visit. Dr. Volk's response was more curt. Visits are not recommended at this time. Your sister's treatment requires complete rest and isolation from family attachments that may impede her recovery. Br. When Martha showed up unannounced at Riverside in March 1912, she was turned away at the door by an orderly who informed her that Dr. Volk was with patients and could not be disturbed. When she demanded to see Clara, she was told that her sister was indisposed and not receiving visitors per doctor's orders. Br. Martha left frustrated but uncertain what to do. Dr. Volk was a respected physician. Surely he knew what was best for Clara's treatment. Perhaps she was being an overprotective sister, interfering with medical care. She never saw Clara again. In August 1914, the parents of 23-year-old Robert Kimball received a letter from Riverside Sanitarium. Their son, who had been admitted a year earlier for what his family described as spells of confusion and violent temper, was being transferred to a state hospital better equipped to handle his condition. The letter, signed by Dr. Volk, stated, Robert Kimball departed Riverside Sanitarium on August 12, 1914, under escort to Harrisburg State Hospital. His personal effects have been forwarded with him. We wish him well in his continued treatment. The Kimballs were surprised. They'd received no prior notice that a transfer was being considered. They immediately contacted Harrisburg State Hospital to inquire about visiting their son. The hospital had no record of Robert Kimball. Dr. When the Kimballs confronted Dr. Volk, he seemed confused. He checked his records and returned with an apologetic explanation. There had been a clerical error. Robert had actually been transferred to Danville State Hospital, not Harrisburg. Br. But Danville had no record of him either. Nor did Warren State Hospital, or any other psychiatric institution in Pennsylvania. Dr. Volk grew defensive. He insisted his records showed a proper transfer, but the transportation paperwork had been misplaced during a recent office reorganization. Br. He suggested that perhaps the receiving hospital had recorded Robert under a different name, a common bureaucratic mix-up. The Kimballs filed a complaint with the county sheriff, but the investigation went nowhere. Riverside's admission book showed Robert Kimball's discharge date. Br. Dr. Volk provided written testimony that the young man had left the facility. Without proof of foul play, authorities couldn't justify further investigation. Robert Kimball simply vanished from all records. Incident 3, the nurse who asked questions Elizabeth Moore worked as a night nurse at Riverside Sanitarium for 4 months in 1918. Unlike previous nurses who quietly resigned, Moore went to the Pennsylvania Board of Medical Examiners with disturbing allegations. According to her sworn statement, she had noticed discrepancies in the patient census. When she began her employment in June 1918, the admission log listed 42 active patients. But during her nightly rounds, she consistently counted only 36 patients in their beds. Br. When she asked Dr. Volk about the discrepancy, he explained that some patients were in intensive treatment rooms that nurses didn't have access to. Moore accepted this explanation until she noticed something else. Certain patient names appeared in the medication log, but not in any ward. Dr. One night in September, Moore decided to investigate. After Dr. Volk left for the evening, she searched the facility for these mystery patients. She found no intensive treatment rooms. Br. She found no patients beyond those in the regular wards. What she did find was a locked door in the basement that she'd never noticed before. When she asked the night orderly about it, he became visibly nervous and told her it was just storage for old medical equipment. But Moore had noticed mud on the floor near that door. fresh mud, as if someone had recently walked through it from outside. The next morning, Elizabeth Moore informed Dr. Volk that she was resigning effective immediately. She later told the medical board that Volk's face had shown something between relief and calculation when she announced her departure. Her allegations were investigated, but the inquiry lasted only 3 days. Dr. Volk provided the medical board with full access to his facility. Inspectors found nothing amiss. Clean wards, orderly records, patients who seemed adequately cared for. The board concluded that Nurse Moore had been confused by the complex administrative systems required to run a psychiatric facility. Elizabeth Moore's testimony was dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled employee. Frederick Hartman was a lawyer from Pittsburgh whose younger brother, Otto, had been committed to Riverside in 1920 after suffering what doctors termed a nervous breakdown following his return from the Great War. Otto had witnessed horrors in the trenches of France, and his family hoped that Dr. Volk's treatment could help him find peace. For the first year, Frederick visited Otto monthly. His brother seemed to be improving, gaining weight, speaking more coherently, showing signs of the gentle personality he'd had before the war. But in November 1921, Frederick arrived for his scheduled visit and was informed that Otto had been placed in restrictive quarantine due to an outbreak of influenza at the facility. Frederick returned in December. Again, he was told Otto couldn't receive visitors. In January 1922, February, March, same story. Unlike previous family members, Frederick Hartman had legal training and connections. He went to the county courthouse and obtained a court order demanding access to his brother. Armed with this order, he returned to Riverside on April 3, 1922, DBR. Dr. Volk complied with the court order. He led Frederick to a private room where Otto sat in a chair, staring vacantly at the wall. Frederick barely recognized his brother. Otto had lost significant weight. His eyes were sunken. He didn't respond to his name or acknowledge Frederick's presence. What happened to him, Frederick demanded. Dr. Volk explained that Otto had suffered a severe deterioration and was now receiving intensive neurological treatments that sometimes produced temporary catatonia as a side effect. Frederick didn't believe him. He arranged for his brother to be transferred to a private psychiatric hospital in Pittsburgh. Dr. Volk initially resisted but eventually agreed when Frederick threatened further legal action. Otto Hartman left Riverside on April 15, 1922 DR. He died 3 weeks later at the Pittsburgh facility. The attending physician noted that Otto appeared to have been severely malnourished and possibly subjected to physical trauma, inconsistent with standard psychiatric care. Frederick Hartman filed a formal complaint with the state medical board, the Attorney General's office, and every authority who would listen. Dr. Volk produced detailed medical records showing that Otto had been properly fed and had injured himself during episodes of violent agitation, a known risk with war veterans suffering from shell shock. Without definitive proof of wrongdoing, and with Otto now dead, the investigation stalled. Frederick Hartman spent the next year trying to build a case against Dr. Volk, but he found himself blocked at every turn by lack of evidence, and the general assumption that a respected physician couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong. Then, in December 1923, a groundskeeper's shovel struck bone beneath the frozen Pennsylvania earth, and Frederick Hartman finally got the evidence he needed. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and help us bring these forgotten horrors to light. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and lost history. Let's discover what happens next in the nightmare of Riverside Sanitarium. Dr. December 14, 1923. Dr. 2:47 in the afternoon. Thomas Brennan, a 46-year-old groundskeeper who had worked at Riverside for only 3 months, stood in a shallow trench behind the sanitarium's main building, staring at the unmistakable curve of a human skull protruding from the dark soil. His first instinct was to cover it back up, to pretend he'd never seen it, to finish his work and go home to his wife and children. But Brennan was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. He'd seen death, he knew what he was looking at. He walked directly to the Hillcrest Police Department. Chief Walter Grayson initially dismissed Brennan's claim. "You probably found an old Indian burial ground," he said. This whole area was tribal land 100 years ago. But Brennan insisted, "Chief, I know the difference between old bones and recent ones. These weren't ancient, and there's more than one. Grayson reluctantly accompanied Brennan back to Riverside. Dr. Volk was in his office when they arrived. The physician seemed genuinely surprised by the discovery, and readily gave permission for the police chief to examine the area. What Grayson found made his blood run cold. Bar the graves, if they could be called that, were shallow, haphazard things. Bodies had been wrapped in canvas or burlap and laid directly in the earth with barely 2 feet of soil covering them. Some had been disturbed by animals, bar others had deteriorated to skeletal remains. By nightfall, with the help of 2 deputies and lanterns casting eerie shadows across the grounds, Grayson had identified at least 7 distinct burial sites. He immediately contacted the county sheriff and the district attorney. Dr. Volk, when questioned, appeared shocked and confused. He suggested that perhaps these were patients who had died years ago, before his tenure, and had been buried according to the customs of the time. He offered to open his records to investigators to help identify any patients who had died under his care. But here's where Volk's story began to unravel. When investigators examined Riverside's death certificates and burial records over the following days, they found documentation for only 11 patient deaths during Dr. Volk's entire 15-year tenure. BR. All 11 had been properly buried in local cemeteries with marked graves that could be verified. BR. The bodies behind the sanitarium weren't in those records. Forensic examination, limited as it was in 1923, suggested that the remains belonged to adults of varying ages. Several showed evidence of malnutrition. One skull showed what the examining physician described as trauma consistent with blunt force. BR. Another skeleton had what appeared to be restraint marks on the wrist bones, deep grooves suggesting prolonged binding. On December 17th, investigators made an even more disturbing discovery. Following a tip from a former orderly who came forward after hearing about the bodies, police searched the sanitarium's basement. Behind a false wall in a storage room, they found what could only be described as a hidden chamber. The room was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. BR. It had no windows. The walls were bare brick. Iron rings were bolted into the wall at intervals, the kind used to secure chains. The floor showed dark stains that would later test positive for human blood. In the corner of this hidden chamber sat a wooden crate. Inside the crate were personal items, a woman's hairbrush with strands of gray hair still caught in its bristles, a man's pocket watch engraved with the initials RBRKBR, a pair of eyeglasses, several letters, and a small stuffed rab. The kind a child might cherish, for each item represented a person who had entered Riverside Sanitarium and never left. By December 20th, as the investigation expanded, the true scope of Dr. Volk's crimes began to emerge. Investigators cross-referenced Riverside's admission records with discharge records and found significant discrepancies. Over 15 years, 68 patients had been admitted to Riverside. BR. According to Dr. Volk's books, 52 had been discharged or transferred. 11 had died, with proper documentation, leaving only 5 currently residing at the facility. But when pressed to provide proof of these discharges and transfers, copies of paperwork, destinations, names of receiving physicians, Dr. Volk couldn't produce documentation for at least 19 patients. BR. They had simply disappeared from the records. The pocket watch with the initials RBRK was confirmed to belong to Robert Kimball, the young man whose parents had been told he'd been transferred to a state hospital in 1914. The stuffed rabbit was identified by Frederick Hartman as belonging to a young woman named Sophie Meyer, who had been admitted to Riverside in 1919 and whose family had been told she died of pneumonia, though they'd never been allowed to see the body. What authorities discovered in that cold December of 1923 was that Dr. Hermann Volk, respected physician and superintendent of Riverside Sanitarium, had been systematically murdering his patients for at least a decade. But the question that haunted investigators was perhaps even more chilling than the crimes themselves. Why had no one stopped him sooner? For Dr. Hermann Volk was arrested on December 21, 1923, and charged with 7 counts of murder, the number of bodies that had been definitively identified at that time. He maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by disgruntled former employees and overzealous investigators who didn't understand the complexities of psychiatric medicine. His trial began on March 4, 1924, in the Allegheny County Courthouse. It would become one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in Pennsylvania history. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Whitcomb, presented a devastating case built on forensic evidence, testimony from former staff members, and heartbreaking statements from family members of the missing patients. Nurse Elizabeth Moore, who had tried to raise alarms in 1918, testified about the discrepancies in patient counts and the mysterious locked basement door. Her earlier dismissal by the medical board now looked like a tragic failure of oversight. An orderly named James Sullivan, who had worked at Riverside from 1915 to 1917, testified that Dr. Volk had instructed him to dispose of medical waste by burying it in the field behind the facility. Sullivan claimed he'd assumed this meant contaminated materials or deceased laboratory animals. It wasn't until the bodies were discovered that he realized what he'd actually been burying. "He told me never to look in the canvas bundles," Sullivan testified, his voice shaking. "Said it was for my own health, that the materials might be infectious. I trusted him. God forgive me, I trusted him. The most damning testimony came from Dr. Lawrence Morton, a psychiatrist brought in to examine Riverside's practices. Morton testified that the treatments described in Dr. Volk's patient files were consistent with torture, not medicine. Patients subjected to extended periods of isolation, starvation diets described as fasting therapy, and something Volk called aversion correction, which appeared to involve physical punishment for undesirable behaviors. These weren't therapeutic interventions, Dr. Morton stated. These were methods of control that would inevitably lead to physical and psychological deterioration. In my professional opinion, Dr. Volk was conducting experiments that prioritized his own curiosity over patient welfare. The prosecution presented evidence that Dr. Volk had been falsifying records to cover his crimes. When patients died, whether from neglect, malnutrition, or more direct violence, he would simply remove them from the active census. If family members inquired, he would fabricate transfers or invent reasons why contact wasn't permitted. The isolated location of Riverside and the general public stigma around mental illness meant that families often accepted these explanations rather than push back against a medical authority. Financial records revealed another motive. Dr. Volk had been collecting payments from the state for patients who were no longer alive. Pennsylvania paid a per-patient subsidy to private psychiatric facilities. By keeping deceased patients on the books and claiming they were still receiving care, Volk had fraudulently collected thousands of dollars over the years. But perhaps the most chilling evidence came from Dr. Volk's personal journals, discovered in his office safe. In methodical, clinical handwriting, Volk had documented his research into what he termed the degradation of the defective mind. One entry from November 1916 read, "Subject M.H., later identified as Martha Hodges' sister Clara, continues to resist corrective protocols. Have eliminated all correspondence privileges to test impact on morale. Hypothesis, removal of hope accelerates acceptance of institutional authority." Another entry from March 1920, "Subject O.H. Otto Hartmann demonstrates persistence of war-induced neuroses. Implementing nutritional restriction combined with isolation to observe threshold at which psychological resistance collapses. Results should inform treatment of other veterans. These weren't the notes of a physician treating patients. These were the observations of someone conducting cruel experiments on helpless human beings. Dr. Volk's defense attorney, a Pittsburgh lawyer named Ed Harold Becker, attempted to argue that his client was conducting legitimate psychiatric research that was simply misunderstood by laypeople. He claimed that early 20th century psychiatry involved experimental treatments that might seem harsh by modern standards, but were accepted practice at the time. This argument fell flat. The prosecution brought in multiple psychiatric experts who testified that Volk's methods violated every standard of ethical medical care, even by 1920s standards. They also pointed out that Volk had deliberately concealed his activities, forged records, and lied to families, behaviors inconsistent with legitimate medical research. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On April 18, 1924, Dr. Hermann Volk was found guilty on all 7 counts of murder. Judge Cornelius Blackburn sentenced him to death by hanging, the maximum penalty available under Pennsylvania law at the time. "You betrayed every principle of medical ethics," Judge Blackburn stated during sentencing. "You exploited the most vulnerable members of society, people who had been placed in your care by families who trusted you. You turned a facility meant for healing into a chamber of horrors. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court shall have none. Dr. Volk showed no emotion as the sentence was read, but the story didn't end with the verdict. As investigators continued examining Riverside's records and excavating the grounds, the number of potential victims grew. By the summer of 1924, Authorities had identified remains belonging to at least 15 individuals, but discrepancies in admission and discharge records suggested there might be more. Perhaps as many as 25 patients who had entered Riverside Sanitarium and vanished. Many bodies were too deteriorated for positive identification. The forensic science of the 1920s couldn't provide the DNA analysis or advanced techniques we have today. Families came forward with photographs and descriptions, hoping to find closure, but in many cases certainty was impossible. The Riverside Sanitarium was permanently closed in May 1924. The building stood empty for 3 years before being purchased by the county and converted into a tuberculosis sanatorium. An ironic fate for a building that had housed so much death. It was finally demolished in 1956. Dr. Hermann Volk never showed remorse. In a brief statement before his execution, he maintained that he had been conducting necessary research into the nature of mental deficiency, and that history would eventually vindicate his work. He was hanged on November 7, 1924, at the Allegheny County Jail. He was 49 years old. But even his death couldn't answer all the questions that haunted those who had investigated the case. The most troubling question: how had this gone on for so long? Multiple investigations were launched into the regulatory failures that allowed Dr. Volk to operate with impunity for 15 years. What they found was a system riddled with gaps, indifference, and the devaluation of mentally ill lives. Pennsylvania's Board of Medical Examiners had received at least 4 formal complaints about Riverside Sanitarium between 1912 and 1923. All had been dismissed after cursory investigation or based on Dr. Volk's professional reputation. The board's chairman resigned in disgrace after testifying that they had given too much deference to Dr. Volk's credentials. State hospital inspectors admitted they had visited Riverside only twice in 15 years, despite regulations requiring annual inspections. Budget constraints and staff shortages meant rural facilities often went years without oversight. Local police had received missing person reports related to Riverside patients but had declined to investigate, assuming these were internal medical matters beyond their jurisdiction. Even the media shared blame. When family members had approached newspapers with concerns about missing relatives, editors had declined to publish stories without concrete proof, not wanting to damage the reputation of a respected physician based on speculation. The most damning revelation came from a legislative investigation that found the county trustees who nominally oversaw Riverside had rubber-stamped Dr. Volk's reports without conducting any independent verification. Several trustees admitted they had never actually visited the facility beyond the initial ribbon-cutting ceremony in 1908. In other words, Dr. Hermann Volk had been able to torture and murder vulnerable people for over a decade because society simply didn't value those people enough to check on them. The Riverside Sanitarium scandal sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania and beyond. It became a national story, covered by newspapers from New York to San Francisco. But more importantly, it sparked genuine reform in how America treated and protected its mentally ill citizens. In 1925, Pennsylvania passed the Psychiatric Facility Oversight Act, which mandated quarterly inspections of all private and public mental health institutions, required independent medical review boards to investigate patient deaths, and established a patient's rights office where family members could file complaints that would trigger mandatory investigation. Other states followed Pennsylvania's lead. By 1930, virtually every state in the Union had strengthened oversight of psychiatric facilities and established clearer standards of care. The case also led to reforms in medical licensing. The American Medical Association, embarrassed that one of its members had committed such atrocities, established stricter ethical guidelines for physicians working in institutional settings, and created mechanisms for peer review that would flag concerning patterns of patient outcomes. But perhaps most significantly, the Riverside scandal contributed to a growing movement that would eventually lead to the deinstitutionalization of mental health care in the latter half of the 20th century. While that movement had its own serious problems and unintended consequences, it was partly motivated by horror stories like Dr. Volk's. Recognition that isolating mentally ill people in institutions away from family and public scrutiny created conditions where abuse could flourish. The case also revealed something darker about human nature and societal prejudice. Dr. Volk had specifically targeted patients who were easiest to make disappear, those with no regular visitors, those from poor families without resources to fight back, those whose conditions made them seem less credible if they tried to report abuse. One of the patients whose remains were identified was a woman named Dorothy Klein, admitted to Riverside in 1917 for hysteria, a diagnosis routinely used to institutionalize women who were inconvenient to their families. Dorothy's sister later testified that the family had essentially abandoned her, relieved to have her taken care of by professionals. When Dorothy stopped writing letters, no one had checked because no one particularly wanted her to come home. "We failed her," Dorothy's sister said at the trial, weeping, Br. "We all failed her. We told ourselves she was sick, that the doctors knew best, that it was for her own good. But the truth is we just wanted her gone, and Dr. Volk gave us permission to forget about her. Br. This uncomfortable truth, that families and society collaborated in the neglect that enabled Volk's crimes, haunted many who followed the case. The Riverside scandal also wasn't unique. As publicity grew around the case, similar horror stories emerged from other institutions across America. In 1925, investigative journalists at the Chicago Tribune exposed appalling conditions at Dunning Asylum, where hundreds of patients had died from neglect. In 1927, the Willowbrook State School in New York came under scrutiny for overcrowding and patient abuse that would continue for decades. Dr. Volk represented an extreme, but he existed on a spectrum of institutional failure that was far more widespread than the public wanted to acknowledge. Interestingly, psychological researchers later studied the Volk case as an example of how authority in institutional settings can enable ordinary people to commit extraordinary cruelty. Some scholars drew parallels between Volk's experiments and the later atrocities discovered in Nazi concentration camps. Both involved medical professionals who viewed certain populations as suitable subjects for dehumanizing research. Dr. Philip Mason, a historian of American psychiatry, wrote in his 1967 book Forgotten Patients, "Hermann Volk wasn't a monster in the sense of being fundamentally different from other human beings. He was a man who possessed medical knowledge, a position of authority, and a complete absence of empathy for those he deemed inferior. That combinatio. N is always dangerous, but it becomes lethal when society provides no meaningful oversight, and when victims are people we've already decided don't fully matter. Br. The families of Riverside's victims never fully recovered. Frederick Hartman, the lawyer whose brother Otto died shortly after being rescued from the facility, spent the rest of his life advocating for patient rights. He established a foundation that provided legal assistance to families dealing with psychiatric institutions and fought for legislation protecting the vulnerable. Martha Hodge, who lost her sister Clara, became a vocal critic of private psychiatric facilities and pushed for more public transparency in mental health care. She testified before the Pennsylvania legislature multiple times, always making the same point. "My sister wrote letters begging for help, and I believed a doctor instead of believing her. We must never again allow institutions to hide their patients from the world." Br. The site where Riverside Sanitarium once stood is now a residential neighborhood. A small memorial park, established in 1989, marks the location. A bronze plaque lists the names of the identified victims. 15 names, followed by the words "and others unknown." Br. Locals say the park is quiet, unusually so. Even children playing there tend to speak in hushed voices, as if something in the ground beneath them commands respect. Every November 7th, the anniversary of Dr. Volk's execution, a small ceremony is held at the memorial. Family descendants, local historians, and mental health advocates gather to remember the patients who died at Riverside, and to recommit themselves to ensuring such horrors never happen again. But the uncomfortable truth is that vulnerable populations remain vulnerable. Nursing homes, psychiatric facilities, group homes, and other institutions still occasionally reveal scandals of neglect and abuse. The mechanisms of oversight have improved, but they're not perfect. Society still struggles with how to balance autonomy and protection for those who cannot fully advocate for themselves. The lesson of Riverside Sanitarium isn't just about one evil doctor. It's about what happens when society decides certain people aren't worth watching over. It's about the danger of unchecked authority. It's about the moral obligation we have to question, to investigate, to care, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient. Dr. Hermann Volk buried his patients in unmarked graves behind his facility. But society had already buried them by forgetting they existed, by trusting too easily, by not asking enough questions. The victims of Riverside Sanitarium died twice, once in that awful place, and once more when the world stopped caring whether they were alive or dead. What do you think drove Dr. Hermann Volk to such acts? Was he a psychopath who entered medicine to gain access to victims? Or did he start with good intentions and gradually lose his humanity? In the isolation of that rural facility, surrounded by patients society had already abandoned? Leave your theories in the comments below.dr. And if you know of similar cases from history, institutions where the vulnerable were forgotten and abused, share those stories with our community. This is the kind of history they don't teach in schools. These are the stories that got buried, literally and figuratively, because they're too uncomfortable to acknowledge. But we remember.br, and by remembering, we honor those 15 identified victims, and the others whose names we'll never know. Subscribe to the Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of history, the dark truths hiding in forgotten corners of the past. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story, because the worst horror isn't what happened in places like Riverside Sanitarium. It's knowing that if we stop paying attention, it could happen again. Bye. See you in the next video.